In the dimly lit conference room of Wright Enterprises, a 58-year-old father was about to destroy his family's delusions of grandeur. What began as a quarterly performance review exploded into chaos when his son told him he was holding the company back. Edward Wright wasn't your average aging CEO. For 20 years, he had meticulously built a manufacturing empire admired for its reliability, with true power hidden beneath his unassuming demeanor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When Jason dismissed his concerns about expansion, he had no idea he was triggering a decision that would shatter his inheritance dreams. Edward's quiet retreat to his private office would unleash a truth about who actually controlled the family's destiny. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you've subscribed because tomorrow's video will change how you think about family business forever. The Wright family would never recover from learning their outdated father had sold everything right from under them. The sleek digital displays around the conference room projected the latest quarterly reports, illuminating the tense faces of the Wright family as they gathered for their monthly business review. Each chart and graph had been carefully prepared by Edward Wright himself, despite his son's repeated suggestions to delegate these simple tasks to the interns. At 58, Edward still insisted on reviewing every number personally, a habit that had served him well during the 2 decades he spent transforming a small regional manufacturing company into a national leader in precision parts. His attention to detail was legendary among their clients but increasingly viewed as micromanagement by his own children. "The numbers are solid, Dad," Jason said, scrolling through the presentation on his tablet without really looking at it. His voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who believed his Harvard MBA had taught him everything worth knowing about business. "But we're leaving money on the table with this conservative approach." Edward noticed how his son's expensive watch caught the light as he gestured dismissively at the profit margins that had kept 300 families employed through 2 recessions. At 34, Jason carried himself with the entitled assurance of someone who had never experienced genuine failure or hardship. Across the table, Edward's daughter Vanessa studied the reports more carefully, her sharp eyes catching details that others missed. At 31, she had surprised everyone by returning to the family business after 5 years at a prestigious consulting firm, bringing valuable outside perspective and a pragmatism that reminded Edward of himself at her age. "Actually," Jason said, setting down his tablet with the deliberate movement of someone who believed his next words would change everything, "I've prepared something I'd like everyone to see." He tapped his screen and the conference room displays shifted to a sleek presentation titled, "Wright Enterprises, The Next Generation." The title slide featured dramatic lighting and modern graphics that felt oddly disconnected from their practical manufacturing business. "The future is digital transformation and global expansion," Jason announced, his voice gaining momentum as he advanced through slides showing ambitious growth projections. "I've been speaking with investors in Singapore and Frankfurt who see tremendous potential in what we could become with the right vision." Edward felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not health-related, but the tension that always arose when Jason pushed for rapid expansion without considering the foundations that made their success possible. "These investors," Edward said, carefully, maintaining the calm tone he'd perfected through decades of negotiation, "what exactly are they proposing?" Jason's smile widened. "That's the beauty of it. They're willing to provide capital for expansion into Asian markets, but they want us to move quickly. The manufacturing facilities in Portland and Detroit would need to be streamlined, or possibly relocated overseas where labor costs are more competitive." The room fell silent. Edward felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not surprise, he'd seen this coming for months, but a crystallizing certainty about decisions he'd been postponing for too long. "You want to outsource production?" Vanessa spoke for the first time since Jason had begun his presentation. Her voice carried the measured consideration of someone who understood both the financial logic and human cost of such decisions. "Not outsource," Jason corrected with the practiced smoothness of a consultant. "Optimize and globalize. The domestic plants are dragging down our profit potential with outdated labor models and unnecessary overhead. Those plants employ people who have been with us for generations," Edward pointed out quietly. "We made commitments to those communities." Jason sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone explaining simple concepts. "Dad, I understand your attachment to the old ways of doing business. The personal relationships, the handshake deals, the loyalty to longtime employees, it all made sense in your era." Edward noted the phrase, "your era," with a sharpness that surprised him. Was that how his son saw him? A relic of business practices that belonged in the past? "But the world has changed," Jason continued, warming to his theme. "Global competition, digital disruption, just-in-time manufacturing, we need to evolve or we'll be left behind. Sentiment is luxury we can't afford if we want to remain competitive. Maria Gonzalez, the company's CFO who had been with Edward since the early days, spoke up. The domestic plants have been profitable for 18 consecutive years. Even during the 2008 recession, they maintained positive cash flow and we kept our workforce intact while competitors were laying people off. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sure, if you call 4 to 6% returns profitable, Jason replied, his tone suggesting he was explaining basic mathematics to children. We're talking about potential returns of 15 to 18% here, maybe more when we factor in the tax advantages of operating globally. During an expansion phase with unproven partners, Edward added quietly. You want to dismantle operations that have consistently delivered reliable returns to chase speculative growth with investors we barely know. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the kind of silence that preceded either reconciliation or irreparable damage. Look, Jason said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that Edward had come to recognize as his default when challenged. I know you want to protect what you've built, and no one respects that more than I do. But this isn't about small-town loyalties or emotional attachments to facilities and staff. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair as her brother continued. This is about securing the future of Wright Enterprises in a global economy. The world is moving forward, Dad. The business world has evolved. You need to stop holding the company back and let the next generation lead the way forward. The words hit Edward like a physical blow. Not because they were particularly cruel, he had heard worse in his decades of business, but because they crystallized something he had been feeling for too long. The dismissal, the assumption that his age made him irrelevant, the casual erasure of his experience and the values that had built their success. Holding the company back, he repeated quietly. That's not exactly what I meant, Jason said, though his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. No. Edward's voice cut through his son's backpedaling with precision earned through years of boardroom negotiations. I understand exactly what you meant. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Every eye at the table tracked his motion, but he looked at no one. If you'll excuse me, I need a moment to consider these proposals carefully. Dad, we're not finished discussing this, Jason began. Yes, Edward said, his hand already on the conference room door. We are. The hallway felt cooler than the conference room, though Edward wasn't sure if that was real or simply the emotional temperature difference. His feet carried him automatically toward his executive office at the end of the corridor, past the photographs of factory openings, employee celebrations, and community events that lined the walls. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Edward allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. The office smelled of leather and mahogany, of the coffee he preferred, and the subtle scent of the beeswax polish that maintenance used on his desk, a desk that had belonged to his father before him. Edward's gaze traveled to the wall where 3 framed items hung in a row. The first was the original business license for Wright Machine Parts, the small shop his father had opened in 1962. The second was a framed photograph of Edward at 28, standing with his father as they broke ground on their first actual factory. The third was the acquisition agreement from 2001 when Edward had made the bold move to purchase their largest competitor, transforming the company into a national leader. Holding the company back, he said to the empty room, his voice barely above a whisper. He moved to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer with a key he still carried on his person, rather than leaving it with his assistant as Jason had repeatedly suggested would be more efficient. From inside, he withdrew a leather portfolio that contained documents only 4 people in the world knew existed. Edward spread the contents across his desk, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating. The papers revealed a truth that would shock his family to their core, the results of 5 years of quiet preparation for exactly this moment. The first document was the full ownership structure of Wright Enterprises, showing that despite the family's assumptions about shared ownership, Edward still controlled 82% of the voting shares. The children had been granted non-voting shares. That provided generous dividends but no actual decision-making authority. Next came the confidential acquisition offers from 3 different companies, each interested in purchasing Wright Enterprises for amounts that would make everyone in the family wealthy beyond their needs for generations. Edward had been quietly entertaining these discussions for months, ever since Jason had first begun pushing for the expansion plan that would dismantle everything Edward valued about the business. The third document was perhaps the most significant. A detailed succession plan that Edward had developed with Maria's help, one that looked very different from what Jason imagined was coming his way. It included performance benchmarks, values assessments, and a structure that would ensure the company's commitments to its employees and communities would be honored regardless of who sat in the CEO's chair. 76%. That was the number Maria had calculated during their private strategic session last month. If Edward sold the company to the most aligned bidder, he could establish a family foundation controlling 76% of the resulting wealth, a foundation with strict guidelines about supporting the communities where Wright Enterprises had operated. The children would receive life-changing wealth, but not control over the legacy. Edward heard his late father's voice from their last conversation before his passing. "They're going to test you, Eddie. The new generation always thinks they know better. They'll push for faster growth, bigger risks, shortcuts to success. Don't let them sacrifice what matters for what glitters." "I let them push me too far," Edward whispered to the photograph on the wall. "For too long, I let them." But as he sat in the chair that had been his father's, surrounded by the evidence of his true authority, Edward felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, though that was certainly present. Not hurt, though that cut deep as well. What he felt was clarity. Jason wanted to act like the visionary leader, like the one who understood modern business, like the one who was ready to take Wright Enterprises global at any cost. Edward Wright was about to give him exactly what he wanted, a lesson in modern business reality that would be unforgettable. He was done holding the company back. Instead, he was going to move it forward in a way no one in the family saw coming. Edward picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Maria, please come to my office. And bring the Pinnacle Acquisitions file with you." 10 minutes later, Maria Gonzalez entered Edward's office with a thick folder tucked under her arm. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her position through talent and perseverance rather than connections or credentials. As CFO, she had been Edward's most trusted advisor for 15 years. One of the few people who understood both the business realities and the values that made Wright Enterprises more than just a manufacturer. "They finally pushed too hard, didn't they?" she asked, settling into the chair across from Edward's desk. Edward nodded, his expression somber but resolved. "Jason wants to dismantle the domestic operations to chase higher margins overseas. He says I'm holding the company back." Maria's lips pressed into a tight line. "And what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time for Plan B," Edward replied, tapping the Pinnacle Acquisitions folder she had brought. For 3 hours, they reviewed the options. Pinnacle Industrial Group had been courting Wright Enterprises for over a year, offering a premium price and, more importantly to Edward, assurances about maintaining the American manufacturing facilities and workforce. Their CEO, Rebecca Chen, had started as a factory floor engineer and built her company with similar values to Wright's. "The offer expires at the end of this quarter," Maria reminded him. "If we're going to move, it needs to be soon." Edward stared at the acquisition agreement, feeling the weight of generations of Wright history. "What about the employees? The communities?" "The contract includes the 10-year commitment to maintain the domestic operations," Maria pointed out. "And with the foundation we've structured, we can ensure ongoing support for educational programs and community development even beyond that time frame." Edward nodded slowly. "And the family?" Maria's expression softened slightly. "They'll be wealthy beyond their dreams, Edward. What they won't have is control, not of the company, not of your legacy." "They'll see it as betrayal," Edward said quietly. "Perhaps," Maria agreed. "Or perhaps they'll eventually recognize it as wisdom." The decision crystallized in Edward's mind, bringing with it not regret but a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about preventing Jason from dismantling what generations had built, it was about ensuring that the values that had made Wright Enterprises successful would endure even if the family ownership did not. "Schedule a meeting with Rebecca for tomorrow," Edward said finally. "And prepare the paperwork for the foundation structure we discussed." Maria nodded, making notes in her precise handwriting. "And the family?" "They'll know when it's done," Edward replied. "Not before." As Maria left to make the arrangements, Edward turned to the window overlooking the company's main production facility. From his office, he could see workers changing shifts, people whose parents and sometimes grandparents had worked for Wright Enterprises. People who had bought homes, raised families, and built lives based on the stability that his father had promised and that Edward had maintained. Holding the company back, he repeated softly to himself. Perhaps he was holding it back from becoming just another soulless global entity that treated people as disposable assets. Holding it back from the kind of short-term thinking that had destroyed so many great American manufacturers. Holding it back from betraying the communities that had supported it for generations. If that was what holding back meant, then perhaps it was exactly what he should have been doing all along. The next morning, Edward arrived at the office earlier than usual, parking his sensible sedan next to his son's imported sports car in the executive lot. The contrast between the vehicles struck him as a fitting metaphor for their different approaches to business and life, reliability versus flash, substance versus appearance. In his office, he reviewed the final acquisition documents one last time, making sure every protection he had negotiated for the employees was ironclad. The sale would make headlines in the business press: family-owned manufacturing leader joins Pinnacle Industrial Group, but the details of the deal would ensure that Wright's legacy of commitment to American manufacturing would continue. At precisely 9:30, his assistant announced Rebecca Chen's arrival. The CEO of Pinnacle Industrial entered Edward's office with the confident stride of someone who had worked her way up from the factory floor to the boardroom through sheer talent and determination. "Edward," she greeted him warmly. "I was pleased to get Maria's call." "Rebecca," he replied, gesturing to the seating area where Maria had already arranged coffee and the final contract documents. "Thank you for making time on such short notice. For this deal? I'd have cancelled a board meeting," she said with a smile that quickly turned serious. "Are you certain about this? It's not too late to change your mind." Edward appreciated her directness. It was one of the qualities that had made him comfortable with Pinnacle as a steward for what he had built. "I'm certain," he said simply. "The time is right. But I need your personal assurance once more that the commitments to the workforce and communities are non-negotiable." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "You have my word, and more importantly, you have binding contractual guarantees. We value what you've built here, Edward. The culture, the quality, the relationships with communities and employees, those are assets we're acquiring, not liabilities to be discarded." For the next hour, they reviewed the final terms, made minor adjustments, and ultimately signed the documents that would transfer ownership of Wright Enterprises to Pinnacle Industrial Group. The amount was staggering, nearly 3 times what the company had been valued at just 5 years earlier, but the money had never been Edward's primary concern. "We'll announce the acquisition next Monday," Rebecca said as they shook hands to conclude the meeting. "That gives you time to inform your family and key staff before it goes public." After she left, Edward sat alone in his office, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the future of the company and its people was secure. Sadness at the end of the Wright family's direct control of the business. And a steely resolve about what came next, telling his children what he had done. Maria knocked softly before entering. "It's done?" Edward nodded. "It's done. Schedule a family meeting for tonight at the house. 7 o'clock. All the transfers are prepared," she confirmed. "The foundation documentation is ready. Once we announce, the funds will move according to the structure we established." "Thank you, Maria," Edward said with genuine gratitude. "For everything. I couldn't have navigated this without you." She smiled with a hint of sadness. "What will you do now? After the transition period?" Edward hadn't spoken much about his personal plans, focusing instead on securing the company's future. "Travel, perhaps. There are places Sarah and I always talked about seeing before she got sick. And the foundation will need guidance, especially in the early years." What he didn't say, but Maria understood, was that his relationship with his children would need to be rebuilt from the ground up after today. The announcement would shatter their assumptions and expectations. The question was whether they would eventually understand his reasons or whether the breach would be permanent. As the day progressed, Edward moved through his regular schedule of meetings and calls, knowing that each was likely his last as the owner of Wright Enterprises. At 5:30, he sent a text message to both his children: "Family dinner tonight at the house. 7 p.m., important matters to discuss." Jason replied almost immediately, "Can't it wait? I'm meeting with potential investors this evening." Edward's response was simple: number 7 p.m. The drive to the family home where he had raised his children, and where he had continued to live alone since Sarah's passing 3 years ago, gave Edward time to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. The colonial-style house sat on 5 acres just outside the city, close enough for a reasonable commute but far enough to provide peace and privacy. As he pulled into the circular driveway, he saw both his children's cars already there, Jason's flashy sports car and Vanessa's more practical luxury sedan. They had let themselves in, as they always did, and Edward found them in the kitchen. Vanessa was preparing a salad while Jason poured himself a generous scotch from Edward's collection. "This must be important to pull me away from the Singapore investors," Jason said by way of greeting. "I hope it's not about yesterday's presentation. I've already revised the proposal to address your concerns about transition timing for the domestic facilities." Edward noted how his son assumed that the discussion would simply continue, that his father's objections were just a temporary roadblock to be navigated around rather than a fundamental disagreement about the company's direction. "Let's eat first." Edward said, not ready to begin the difficult conversation on an empty stomach. Then we'll talk. Dinner was a strained affair. Jason dominated the conversation with details about his investor meetings and expansion plans, while Vanessa occasionally attempted to steer the discussion toward less contentious topics. Edward said little, observing his children with the kind of focused attention that comes from knowing a relationship is about to fundamentally change. Finally, as they moved to the living room with coffee, Edward knew the moment had arrived. I've made a decision about the future of Wright Enterprises, he began, his voice calm but firm. Jason perked up immediately. You're moving forward with the expansion? That's excellent, Dad. I can have the paperwork ready by, I've sold the company, Edward interrupted quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. Jason froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Vanessa's eyes widened in shock. That's not funny, Dad, Jason said finally, his voice strained. It's not meant to be, Edward replied. As of this morning, Wright Enterprises is part of Pinnacle Industrial Group. The deal will be announced publicly on Monday. You can't be serious, Jason set his cup down so hard that coffee sloshed over the rim. You can't just sell the family company without consulting us. Actually, I can, Edward said, maintaining his calm. I own 82% of the voting shares. The sale has been finalized and the contracts are signed. This is insane, Jason was on his feet now, pacing the living room. What about our plans? The expansion? The future we've been building toward? Your plans, Edward corrected gently. Not the company's plans, and certainly not mine. Vanessa, who had been silent until now, spoke in a measured tone that barely contained her own shock. Dad, why would you do this without talking to us first? It was a fair question, asked without Jason's entitled anger, and it deserved an honest answer. Because the vision Jason has been pushing would dismantle everything that matters about Wright Enterprises, Edward explained. The commitment to American manufacturing. The multi-generational workforce. The relationships with communities where we operate. Those aren't outdated sentiments, they're the foundation of our success. They're limitations that were holding us back from becoming a truly global player, Jason countered, his face flushed with anger. And that's precisely why I made this decision, Edward said, looking directly at his son. Because you see values as limitations. You see commitments to people as obstacles to profit. That's not the legacy I want for the company your grandfather founded. Jason's expression darkened further. So instead, you destroy the legacy completely? How does that make any sense? The legacy isn't destroyed, Edward replied. It's protected. Pinnacle has contractually committed to maintaining all domestic operations for a minimum of 10 years. No outsourcing, no mass layoffs, no community abandonment. And us? Jason demanded. What about your actual family? Did you think about us at all when you were making this unilateral decision? Edward reached for the portfolio he had placed on the coffee table earlier. I thought about you a great deal, he said, opening it to reveal documents bearing the logo of the newly established Wright Family Foundation. Each of you will receive a significant personal distribution from the sale proceeds, enough that neither of you will ever need to work again if you choose not to, Edward explained, handing them each a document detailing their inheritance. The remainder, approximately 76% of the total, will go into the foundation, which will support education, healthcare, and economic development in the communities where Wright Enterprises operates. Jason stared at the number on the page. An 8-figure sum that represented more money than most people would see in several lifetimes, but his expression remained furious. This is about control, he said accusingly. You couldn't stand the idea of stepping aside and letting me take the company in a new direction, so you'd rather sell it to strangers. The accusation hung in the air, its partial truth making it impossible to dismiss entirely. Edward had indeed been unwilling to see Jason dismantle what generations had built, but not out of mere stubbornness or inability to change. This is about values, Edward corrected. About keeping promises. About recognizing that a company is more than a vehicle for maximizing return on investment, it's a community of people who depend on each other. He looked between his two children, seeing their different reactions. Jason's fury. Vanessa's quiet calculation as she processed what this meant for her future. Yesterday, you told me I was holding the company back, Edward continued, addressing Jason directly. You're right that I was preventing a certain kind of change, the kind that would have broken faith with everything Wright Enterprises has stood for since your grandfather opened that first machine shop. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the property where his children had grown up, where he and Sarah had planned a future that her early death had cut short. To maximize shareholder value? Reynolds interrupted. If the sale price is significantly above market valuation, which you said it is, that obligation has been met. Your shares are worth more today than they were yesterday. Jason's grip on his phone tightened. This isn't about the money, Lawrence. It's about my future. My legacy. The plans I've been developing for years. The attorney's sigh was audible. Jason, I'll review the documents if you want, but from what you're describing, your father has acted within his legal rights. The question is whether fighting this in court is worth the inevitable family damage and public spectacle. After hanging up, Jason stood at his window, watching the city come to life below. The reality was slowly sinking in. His father had outmaneuvered him completely. The company Jason had expected to inherit and transform was now beyond his reach. His phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa, "Going to see Dad this morning. Want to join and keep it civil, or should I go alone?" Jason's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he typed his response, "Go ahead. I'm meeting with lawyers. This isn't over." At the Wright family home, Edward sat in his study reviewing emails from Rebecca Chen. The Pinnacle CEO had sent a draft of Monday's press announcement for his approval, along with initial transition plans for the leadership team. The details were exactly as they had agreed, emphasizing continuity for employees, commitment to domestic manufacturing, and a smooth integration process that would preserve Wright's culture and customer relationships. A knock at the door interrupted his review. Edward looked up to see his housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, who had been with the family for nearly 2 decades. "Miss Vanessa is here to see you, Mr. Wright," she announced with the formal tone she always used during family tensions, having witnessed enough Wright disagreements over the years to develop a sixth sense for when to be especially proper. "Thank you, Eleanor. Please show her in." Vanessa entered carrying the portfolio he had given her the previous evening, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. At 31, she had developed the kind of measured poise that reminded Edward powerfully of her mother, able to contain emotions beneath a calm exterior until she decided to reveal them. "Coffee," he offered, gesturing to the pot Mrs. Winters had left. "Please." Vanessa settled into the leather chair across from his desk, setting the portfolio between them like a boundary marker. Edward poured 2 cups, giving himself time to assess his daughter's mood. Unlike Jason's explosive anger, Vanessa's reactions were typically more measured and therefore harder to anticipate. "You have questions," he said finally, handing her a cup. "Several," she acknowledged, accepting the coffee. "Starting with why Pinnacle? If you were determined to sell, there would have been many interested buyers." It was a good question, practical and insightful, focusing on the business logic rather than emotional reactions. Exactly what he would have expected from Vanessa. Rebecca Chen built Pinnacle from the ground up, Edward explained. She started as an engineer on the production floor and worked her way to CEO. She understands manufacturing from every angle, and she shares our commitment to American production and workforce development. Vanessa nodded slightly. "The 10-year commitment to maintain domestic operations? Non-negotiable and legally binding," Edward confirmed. "With significant financial penalties for any reduction in workforce or facility closures." Vanessa sipped her coffee, considering this information. "And the foundation structure? 76% of the proceeds?" "Also non-negotiable," Edward said. "The foundation ensures that the wealth Wright Enterprises has generated will continue to support the communities where our success was built. Education, healthcare, economic development, investments in the future of those towns. With you as chairman," Vanessa observed. Initially, Edward agreed. "With seats reserved for both you and Jason, should you choose to participate." Vanessa set down her cup and opened the portfolio, spreading several of the documents across the desk. "I've been reviewing these since dawn. The structure is impressive. Comprehensive. Almost as if you've been planning this for years." The observation hung in the air between them, not quite an accusation, but a recognition that this had not been a hasty decision. 5 years, Edward admitted. "Since the last time Jason proposed outsourcing production to increase margins. I realized then that our visions for the company's future were fundamentally incompatible." 5 years, Vanessa repeated quietly. "And you never thought to discuss it with me? To see if there might be a third path?" There it was, the hurt beneath the practical questions. Not just that Edward had sold the company, but that he hadn't trusted Vanessa enough to include her in the process. "I considered it," Edward said honestly. "Especially after you returned from Deloitte with valuable outside perspective. But by then, the plans were already in motion, and I couldn't risk Jason discovering them prematurely." "Because you knew I might tell him?" "Because I knew you would be caught in the middle," Edward corrected. "Forced to either keep secrets from your brother or betray your father's confidence. I didn't want to put you in that position." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, processing this explanation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not anger, but something more complex. Do you remember what Mom used to say about the difference between protecting people and controlling them? The question caught Edward by surprise, stirring memories of Sarah's gentle but firm wisdom. His late wife had often been the family's emotional center, the one who could translate between Edward's strategic thinking and the children's more immediate perspectives. She said the difference was whether you were preventing harm or preventing growth, Edward recalled softly. And which do you think you were doing with this decision? Vanessa asked, her gaze direct and challenging. The question struck at the heart of Edward's actions, forcing him to examine his motives beyond the business rationale he had constructed. Both, perhaps, he admitted after a thoughtful pause. I was preventing harm to the company's legacy and the people who depend on it. But I was also preventing Jason from learning certain lessons through failure. And me? What were you preventing from me? Edward met his daughter's gaze directly. For you, I was preventing opportunity, the chance to help shape a different solution. That was my mistake. The acknowledgement seemed to shift something in Vanessa's expression, not full forgiveness, but a softening of her disappointment. Jason is talking to lawyers, she said, changing direction. He's determined to challenge the sale. I expected as much, Edward nodded. He won't succeed legally, but the attempt itself will be painful for everyone. Why not just leave him the company? Vanessa asked bluntly. Let him make his mistakes and learn from them? Isn't that part of growth too? Edward stood and moved to the window overlooking the back gardens where Sarah had spent so many happy hours. Her rose bushes were beginning to bud in the early spring warmth. Because the stakes were too high, he said finally. Jason's mistakes wouldn't just affect him, they would impact hundreds of families who have trusted Wright Enterprises with their livelihoods for generations. Some lessons are too expensive when other people have to pay the price. He turned back to face his daughter. The company was never just ours, Vanessa. We were stewards of something larger, a community, a tradition of quality, a promise to people who work hard and deserve security in return. And now it belongs to Pinnacle, Vanessa observed. Now it belongs to someone who understands that stewardship, Edward corrected. Someone who won't dismantle it for short-term gains or sacrifice its soul for higher margins. Vanessa gathered the documents, returning them neatly to the portfolio. I need time to think about the foundation position, she said finally. This is a lot to process. Take all the time you need, Edward replied. The foundation will be there when you're ready, if you're ready. As Vanessa prepared to leave, she paused at the door. For what it's worth, Dad, I don't think you're wrong about Jason's plans being wrong for the company. I just think there might have been a different way to address it. After she left, Edward returned to his desk, the weight of his decisions settling around him like a heavy cloak. The sale had been necessary, of that he remained convinced. But the cost to his family was proving to be exactly as high as he had feared. His phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, news starting to leak. Several employees have called me asking about rumors. Recommend accelerating announcement to tomorrow instead of Monday. The speed of information flow didn't surprise Edward. In a company town like theirs, significant changes rarely remained secret for long. He texted back his agreement, then called Rebecca Chen to coordinate the revised timeline. By Sunday morning, the news of Wright Enterprises' acquisition by Pinnacle Industrial Group was official, announced in a joint press release that emphasized continuity for employees, ongoing commitment to American manufacturing, and enhanced opportunities through combined resources and expertise. Edward spent the day fielding calls from key managers, longtime employees, and community leaders, reassuring them that the promises in the press release were backed by contractual guarantees and genuine commitment from Pinnacle's leadership. The local paper's business editor, who had covered Wright Enterprises for 20 years, requested an interview that Edward granted immediately. They met at the company headquarters, in the same conference room where Jason had presented his expansion plan just days earlier. Mr. Wright, this announcement has taken many by surprise, the editor began. Wright Enterprises has been family-owned for 3 generations. Why sell now? Edward had prepared carefully for this question, knowing it would be asked repeatedly. In the coming weeks. Wright Enterprises has always been about more than family ownership, he replied. It's been about quality, reliability, and commitment to our workforce and communities. This partnership with Pinnacle ensures those values will continue for generations to come. There are rumors that your son Jason had different plans for the company's future, the editor pressed. Plans involving global expansion and potentially moving some operations overseas. Edward maintained his composed expression, despite the directness of the question. Every generation brings fresh ideas, which is valuable. But ultimately, as majority shareholder, I had to make decisions that aligned with the company's core values and long-term interests of all stakeholders. Including the 10-year commitment to maintain all domestic operations? That was non-negotiable, Edward confirmed. Our employees and communities have supported Wright Enterprises for decades. That loyalty deserves to be reciprocated. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering details of the transition plan, the newly established Wright Family Foundation, and Edward's personal plans after the 6-month consultation period. What wasn't discussed, what Edward kept carefully private, was the family conflict behind the decision. The public would see a strategic business move and generous community foundation. They wouldn't see the broken relationships and bitter accusations that had accompanied the announcement. As Edward left the building that had been the center of his professional life for 30 years, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what he had built and protected, sadness at the fractured family bonds, and a steely resolve to see the transition through, regardless of the personal cost. Monday morning brought a different kind of challenge. Jason had followed through on his threat, filing a legal motion to temporarily halt the sale pending review of shareholder protections. The action was expected but still painful, a public declaration of family division that would now play out in court documents and business press. Edward met with the company's legal team, who assured him the challenge had little merit given the structure of the shareholding and the premium price of the acquisition. Still, it would delay certain aspects of the transition and create unnecessary anxiety among employees and customers. As he left the legal meeting, Edward received a call from Rebecca Chen. "Edward, I've just been served with Jason's filing," she began without preamble. "My legal team says it's groundless, but I wanted to hear directly from you. Is this going to be a problem for the transition?" "A complication, not a problem," Edward assured her. "The legal foundation for the sale is solid. This is a family matter expressing itself through legal channels." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, digesting this diplomatic description. "I understand family businesses," she said finally. "My father and brother nearly destroyed ours with similar conflicts before I bought them out. If there's anything I can do to help navigate this situation, please let me know." The offer was generous, but Edward knew this particular challenge was his alone to address. "Thank you, Rebecca. For now, the best approach is to proceed with the transition as planned while the legal process runs its course." After hanging up, Edward made a decision he had been contemplating since seeing the legal filing. He dialed Jason's number, not expecting his son to answer but needing to make the attempt. To his surprise, Jason picked up on the third ring. "What do you want?" His voice was cold, controlled in a way that was more concerning than his previous explosive anger. "I'd like to meet," Edward said simply. "Just the two of us. No lawyers, no accusations. Just a conversation." "There's nothing to discuss," Jason replied. "You've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. The courts will decide what happens next." "The courts will uphold the sale," Edward said, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. "You know that, Jason. This legal challenge will only delay the inevitable while damaging both the company's stability and our family's privacy. Concerned about your legacy being tarnished?" The question carried a bitter edge. "Concerned about unnecessary harm to people who depend on Wright Enterprises," Edward corrected. "And yes, concerned about our family. Whatever our business disagreements, we're still father and son." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Jason spoke again, his voice slightly less hostile. "One meeting. Tomorrow morning, 7:30, at Riverside Park. Neutral ground." "I'll be there," Edward agreed, sensing that pushing for more would only rekindle Jason's defensive anger. After hanging up, Edward sat in his car for several minutes, contemplating the conversation ahead. His son's anger was understandable. Jason had spent years planning his future leadership of Wright Enterprises, only to have that future evaporate overnight. The question was whether there was any path forward that could preserve their relationship while still protecting the company's values. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cool, with spring sunshine glinting off the river that ran through the heart of the city. Edward arrived at Riverside Park early, choosing a bench with a view of both the water and the manufacturing district visible across the river, a physical reminder of what was at stake in their conversation. Jason arrived precisely at 7:30. Dressed in running clothes as if to suggest this meeting was just a brief interruption to his morning routine. He remained standing rather than joining Edward on the bench, maintaining both physical and emotional distance. "You wanted to talk," he said without greeting. "So talk." Edward gestured to the space beside him. "Will you sit? This may take more than a few minutes." Jason hesitated, then reluctantly sat at the far end of the bench, his body language clearly communicating his unwillingness to be there. "I've been thinking about what your mother would say about all this," Edward began, looking out at the river rather than directly at his son. About how we've reached this point. Don't bring Mom into this, Jason said sharply. She's not here to defend herself or take sides. Edward nodded, acknowledging the boundary. You're right. I apologize. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Edward tried a different approach. Do you remember your first summer working at the plant? You were 16, assigned to the shipping department. You came home every day exhausted and frustrated. Because it was harder than you expected. Jason's expression remained guarded, but something in his posture softened slightly at the memory. What about it? You wanted to quit after the first week, Edward continued. But your grandfather convinced you to stick it out for the whole summer. He said understanding the work from the ground up was essential for anyone who wanted to lead someday. I remember, Jason acknowledged. What's your point? My point is that Wright Enterprises was built on a philosophy that leadership requires understanding every level of the operation, that quality matters more than speed, that people aren't just resources but partners in success. Edward turned slightly to face his son directly. Your expansion plans would have dismantled that philosophy, Jason. Not because global growth is inherently wrong, but because your approach prioritized profit margins over the commitments we've made to our workforce and communities. Jason's jaw tightened. Business evolves, Dad. Companies that don't adapt get left behind. There are different ways to adapt, Edward countered. Pinnacle has grown globally while maintaining their domestic manufacturing base. They've embraced automation to improve efficiency without eliminating jobs, retraining workers for higher skilled positions instead. There are paths to evolution that don't require abandoning your principles. So instead of letting me find that path, you just sold the company out from under me? Jason's voice rose slightly, the controlled facade cracking. Edward recognized the genuine pain beneath his son's anger, the feeling of betrayal that went beyond business disagreements to something more personal. I made a choice to protect what matters most about Wright Enterprises, Edward said quietly. The sale to Pinnacle ensures that the values your grandfather and I built into the company will continue. That the promises we've made to our people will be kept. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But I recognize that in making that choice, I hurt you. For that, I am genuinely sorry, Jason. The apology seemed to catch Jason off guard. He had clearly been prepared for justifications or counterarguments, not an acknowledgement of the personal wound. If you're so sorry, withdraw from the sale, he said, but the demand lacked his earlier conviction. You know I can't do that, Edward replied. The contracts are signed. The transition has begun. And more importantly, it's the right decision for Wright Enterprises and the people who depend on it. Jason stood abruptly, his temporary vulnerability vanishing behind renewed anger. Then there's nothing more to discuss. See you in court, Dad. As his son walked away, Edward remained on the bench, watching the morning light play across the river. The meeting had gone about as well as he could have realistically expected, which was to say, not well at all. The breach between them remained as wide as ever, with no clear path to reconciliation. But he had made the attempt. He had acknowledged his son's pain, even while standing firm on the decision itself. What happened next would depend on whether Jason could eventually separate his wounded pride from the business realities that had necessitated the sale. Edward knew from experience that some lessons could only be learned through time and reflection. The question was whether his relationship with his son could survive long enough for that learning to occur. As he finally rose to leave, Edward looked once more at the manufacturing district across the river, the physical manifestation of what he had built and what he had now entrusted to new stewardship. Whatever the personal cost, he remained convinced that protecting Wright Enterprises' legacy had been worth the sacrifice. His son had accused him of holding the company back. Perhaps someday Jason would understand that sometimes, holding firm to your values was the most progressive stance of all. The next 3 weeks unfolded in a flurry of legal documents, transition meetings, and public relations challenges as news of the Wright Enterprises acquisition spread through the industry. The business press covered the story extensively, with headlines ranging from neutral assessments, family-owned manufacturing leader joins Pinnacle Industrial Group, to more sensational angles, family feud leads to surprise sale of manufacturing stalwart. Edward navigated these turbulent waters with the steady hand that had guided Wright Enterprises through previous storms, maintaining a calm public persona while privately dealing with the emotional toll of his fractured family relationships. Jason's legal challenge had proceeded as expected, with a preliminary hearing scheduled for the following month. Meanwhile, the day-to-day work of transitioning the company continued uninterrupted. On a Wednesday morning, Edward sat in his home office reviewing the latest transition reports when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Maria Gonzalez's name. Edward, I think you should come to the office, she said without preamble. There's something you need to see. The urgency in her voice was unusual. In 15 years as CFO, Maria had rarely asked Edward to drop everything and come in. "What's happened?" he asked, already reaching for his jacket. "The Portland plant manager just called. Jason showed up there this morning with a film crew and several workers who were recently laid off from Westfield Manufacturing." Edward felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Westfield had been one of their competitors until it was purchased by a private equity firm 2 years ago. The subsequent optimization had resulted in the plant's closure and production moving overseas. "What exactly is he doing?" "Filming interviews with our employees about their fears regarding the Pinnacle acquisition," Maria explained. "And juxtaposing their concerns with testimony from the Westfield workers about what happened after their company was sold. The strategy was clever and potentially damaging. By comparing Wright's sale to Westfield's, Jason was creating a narrative that undermined confidence in the promises Edward and Pinnacle had made about preserving jobs and operations. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Edward said, ending the call. The drive to Wright Enterprises headquarters gave Edward time to consider his response. Jason's move was more sophisticated than a simple legal challenge. It was an attempt to create public pressure and employee anxiety that could complicate the transition or even pressure Pinnacle to renegotiate terms. When Edward arrived at the office, he found Maria waiting in the lobby with Rebecca Chen, who had apparently flown in that morning when she heard about Jason's activities. "This is a coordinated effort," Rebecca said as they walked toward the conference room. "Similar film crews have appeared at 3 other manufacturing companies Pinnacle has acquired in recent years, all asking pointed questions about whether we've kept our promises to maintain operations and employment levels." "Jason's been busy," Edward observed grimly. "Very," Maria confirmed. "He's lined up interviews with business journalists for tomorrow, presumably to share whatever footage they're gathering today." In the conference room, they found a hastily assembled crisis team including Wright's HR director, legal counsel, and communications manager. On a large screen, they watched live social media posts from the Portland facility showing Jason speaking with groups of employees, his expression concerned as he listened to their fears about the acquisition. "He's playing this well," Rebecca noted with grudging professional respect. "The visuals are powerful, the son fighting for the workers while the father sells out to corporate interests." Edward studied the footage, recognizing the narrative being constructed. It was emotionally compelling, even if it ignored the legally binding protections he had negotiated specifically to prevent what happened at places like Westfield. "We need to respond," the communications manager said. Quickly and decisively. Edward considered his options. A public battle with his son would only escalate the situation and potentially damage both Wright's reputation and the transition process. But allowing this misleading narrative to spread unchallenged could undermine employee trust and customer confidence. "I'll go to Portland," he decided. "Today. No press, no cameras, just me talking directly with our people. Rebecca, if you're willing, I'd like you to join me." Rebecca nodded immediately. "I was about to suggest the same thing. Transparent communication is the only effective response to fearmongering." "What about the legal angle?" asked the company's attorney. "Jason's activities could be construed as interfering with a business transaction." Edward shook his head. "We're not going to sue my son for talking to our employees. That would only reinforce the narrative he's creating." While the team made arrangements for the Portland visit, Edward stepped out to make a call he'd been avoiding. He dialed Vanessa's number, hoping his daughter might provide insight into her brother's strategy. "Dad," Vanessa answered, her tone neutral. "I was wondering when you'd call." "You've heard about Jason's activities," Edward surmised. "It's all over my social feeds," she confirmed. "Pretty compelling storytelling, I have to admit." Edward couldn't tell from her voice whether she approved of Jason's tactics or was simply making a professional observation. "Did you know he was planning this?" he asked directly. Vanessa paused before answering. "Not the specifics. He mentioned wanting to build public awareness about the human cost of acquisitions, but I didn't know about the film crews or the Westfield workers." "And what do you think of his approach?" Another pause, longer this time. "I think he's fighting the only way he knows how," she finally said. "He can't win legally, so he's trying to win in the court of public opinion. At the potential cost of destabilizing Wright Enterprises and frightening hundreds of employees who are already nervous about change," Edward pointed out. "Yes," Vanessa acknowledged. "Though in his mind, he's trying to protect them from what he believes will eventually happen anyway, despite your contractual guarantees." The insight was valuable, reminding Edward that Jason genuinely believed he was acting as a defender, not merely a disgruntled heir. "I'm going to Portland today," Edward told her. "To speak directly with the employees there." "Want company?" Vanessa offered, surprising him. "You'd come?" I may not agree with how you handled the sale, she said, but I also don't agree with scaring employees to make a point. If having both of us there would help reassure people, I'm willing. The offer touched Edward deeply. Whatever her reservations about his decisions, Vanessa was choosing constructive engagement over destructive opposition. I would appreciate that very much, he said sincerely. 3 hours later, the Wright Enterprises corporate jet touched down in Portland with Edward, Vanessa, and Rebecca Chen on board. They drove directly to the manufacturing facility, where tension was palpable as they entered. Word of their arrival had spread quickly, and employees watched them with expressions ranging from curiosity to open concern. Jason and his film crew had departed shortly after hearing Edward was en route, but the impact of their visit remained in the anxious conversations and worried glances exchanged on the production floor. The plant manager, Helen Curtis, greeted them at the entrance. A 25-year veteran of Wright Enterprises who had started as a line worker, Helen had been personally promoted by Edward to her current position 10 years earlier. It's getting rough out there, she said without preamble, leading them toward the break room where employees were gathering for an impromptu meeting. Jason really stirred things up. Those Westfield workers had some heartbreaking stories about what happened after their plant closed. That's not going to happen here, Edward assured her. That's exactly why we chose Pinnacle and negotiated specific protections. Helen's expression remained skeptical. With all due respect, Mr. Wright, we've all heard those kinds of promises before. Westfield's workers heard them too. The comment underscored the challenge ahead. Trust, once questioned, wasn't easily restored with mere reassurances, even from someone with Edward's track record. The break room fell silent as they entered. Nearly 200 employees had crowded in, standing against walls and sitting on tables when chairs ran out. These were the people who had built Wright Enterprises' reputation for quality, skilled workers who had dedicated years, sometimes decades, to the company. Edward moved to the front of the room, declining the offer of a microphone. He had always preferred to speak directly to his employees without technology creating distance. I know many of you spoke with my son Jason earlier today, he began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. I know you heard concerning stories from former Westfield employees about what happened after their company was acquired. And I know you're worried about whether the same thing might happen here. He paused, looking around the room and making eye contact with many of the workers he knew personally from his regular visits to the facility. Those concerns are legitimate. In today's business environment, we've all seen too many companies sold, stripped down, and shipped overseas. What happened to Westfield was a tragedy, not just for the workers who lost their jobs, but for the community that lost a cornerstone business, and for American manufacturing as a whole. Edward gestured toward Rebecca, who stood nearby with Vanessa. That's precisely why I chose Pinnacle Industrial as our partner, and why I insisted on legally binding protections for all Wright facilities and employees as a non-negotiable condition of the sale. He reached into his jacket and withdrew several pages of documents. This is Section 12 of the acquisition agreement. It specifically prohibits closure or workforce reduction at any domestic facility for a minimum of 10 years, with financial penalties that would make such actions economically irrational. I've brought copies for each department to review with your union representatives. One of the senior machinists spoke up. With respect, Mr. Wright, contracts can be broken if the penalties cost less than keeping the promises. A fair point, Edward acknowledged. Which is why the penalties were calculated at approximately 3 times the potential savings from closure or outsourcing. Rebecca Chen stepped forward. May I address this concern directly? Edward nodded, stepping aside to give her the floor. My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm the CEO of Pinnacle Industrial Group, she began. Like many of you, I started on the production floor. I was a line engineer for 12 years before moving into management. I understand manufacturing not from business school case studies, but from direct experience. Her straightforward approach seemed to resonate with the room. Pinnacle has acquired 7 American manufacturing companies over the past decade. We have not closed a single domestic facility. We have not conducted mass layoffs or outsourced production overseas. That's not speculation or promises, that's our verifiable track record. She paused, making eye contact with various workers around the room. We acquired Wright Enterprises precisely because of its skilled workforce, quality standards, and community commitments. Dismantling those assets would defeat the entire purpose of the acquisition. A younger worker near the back raised his hand. But what about automation? That's how companies reduce workforce without technically breaking no-layoff promises. Rebecca nodded, accepting the challenge. Automation is coming to all manufacturing, that's simply reality. But there's a difference between using technology to eliminate jobs and using it to make jobs safer and more productive. She outlined Pinnacle's approach to technological modernization, which included comprehensive retraining programs and internal promotion paths for workers affected by automation. The concrete examples she provided of how this had worked at other Pinnacle facilities seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Throughout the discussion, Edward noticed Vanessa watching both the employees and Rebecca with thoughtful attention, occasionally making notes on her phone. Her presence lent a sense of family continuity that was particularly valuable given Jason's earlier visit. After nearly 2 hours of questions and answers, with both Edward and Rebecca addressing concerns with specific details rather than vague reassurances, the mood in the room had noticeably shifted. Anxiety hadn't disappeared, but it had been replaced by cautious optimism in many faces. As the meeting concluded and workers began returning to their stations, Helen Curtis approached Edward. "That helped," she said quietly. "Seeing you both here, answering tough questions directly, it matters." "Thank you for organizing it on such short notice," Edward replied. "Keep me informed about any ongoing concerns." As they prepared to leave, Vanessa pulled Edward aside. "I need to talk to you privately before we head back." They found a quiet corner of the administrative offices while Rebecca spoke with the plant's engineering team about upcoming modernization plans. "You were right," Vanessa said without preamble. Edward raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "About Pinnacle being the right partner. About the importance of contractual protections. About putting the employees' interests first." She gestured toward the production floor visible through the office windows. "Watching you and Rebecca today, the way you addressed concerns directly, with specific commitments rather than corporate doublespeak, it validated your approach." The admission clearly wasn't easy for her, and Edward appreciated both her honesty and her willingness to reconsider her position. "Thank you for coming today," he said sincerely. "Having you here made a difference." Vanessa nodded, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind throughout the visit. "What are we going to do about Jason?" The "we" didn't escape Edward's notice, a small but significant shift in how Vanessa was positioning herself in the family conflict. "I'm open to suggestions," he admitted. Legally, his actions are problematic but likely not enough to justify an injunction. Emotionally, they're coming from a place of genuine belief that he's protecting people, misguided as his methods might be. Vanessa considered this. "Let me talk to him," she offered. "Not to try to change his mind about the sale, that ship has sailed, but to at least get him to consider the real impact of his campaign on the employees he claims to be defending." Edward nodded gratefully. "I'd appreciate that. But be prepared, he may see you as taking my side." "I'm not taking sides," Vanessa clarified. "I'm trying to prevent unnecessary damage to both the company and our family." On the flight back, while Rebecca made calls from the rear of the plane, Edward and Vanessa continued their conversation about the foundation Edward had established with the majority of the sale proceeds. "The structure is impressive," Vanessa acknowledged, reviewing the documents Edward had brought. Particularly the educational initiatives focused on advanced manufacturing skills and the economic development grants for communities where automation might reduce traditional employment opportunities. "Your mother's influence," Edward explained. "She always insisted that with privilege comes responsibility, not just to avoid harm, but to actively create opportunity." The mention of Sarah Wright brought a brief smile to Vanessa's face. She would have approved of this approach, I think. Though she probably would have found a way to bring Jason along rather than having it erupt into open conflict. "She always was better at managing family dynamics than I am," Edward agreed ruefully. "It's not too late," Vanessa observed. "For the family, I mean. The business decision is made, but how we move forward as a family is still being determined." The observation stayed with Edward as they landed and parted ways, Vanessa heading to her apartment while Edward returned to the family home. The day had been exhausting but productive. Addressing employee concerns directly had been the right approach, and Vanessa's shift toward engagement rather than opposition was an unexpected positive development. As evening settled over the Wright family home, Edward found himself in his study again, surrounded by reminders of the business legacy he had built and was now entrusting to new stewardship. The weight of the day's events pressed on him, but alongside the fatigue was a renewed sense of purpose. He had made the right decision for Wright Enterprises, regardless of the personal cost. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Portland team reports positive shift in mood after our visit. Similar sessions scheduled for Detroit and Chicago. Facilities next week. We're making progress." The message confirmed what Edward had felt during the plant visit, that direct engagement and transparent communication were the most effective counters to fear and uncertainty. It was a lesson he had learned early in his career but one that businesses often forgot in the complex choreography of mergers and acquisitions. Another message arrived, this one from Vanessa, "Meeting Jason for breakfast tomorrow. We'll let you know how it goes." Edward typed a simple, "thank you," in response, grateful for his daughter's willingness to attempt bridge building where he had failed. Whether Jason would be receptive remained to be seen, but the effort itself represented hope for eventual reconciliation. As he prepared for bed, Edward found himself drawn to the family photographs that lined the hallway, images that chronicled not just business milestones but personal ones as well. Jason's graduation, Vanessa's first art exhibition, family vacations and holiday gatherings. The visual reminder that beyond business disagreements and succession conflicts, they were still a family, damaged perhaps, but not yet destroyed. The following morning, Vanessa sat across from her brother at a quiet cafe downtown, watching him stir his coffee with the same intensity he brought to everything, as if even this simple act required his complete focus and determination. "I saw the footage from Portland," she said, breaking the silence between them. "Powerful stuff." Jason looked up, clearly trying to determine whether her comment was approval or criticism. People deserve to know what really happens when family businesses get sold to larger entities. "I agree," Vanessa said carefully. "But there's a difference between raising valid concerns and creating panic among workers who are already anxious about change." Jason's expression hardened. "Taking Dad's side now?" "I'm not taking sides," Vanessa replied evenly. "I was in Portland yesterday after your visit. I saw firsthand how frightened people were after hearing those Westfield stories." "They should be frightened," Jason insisted. "Corporate promises aren't worth the paper they're printed on when profit margins are at stake." Vanessa sipped her tea, considering her next words carefully. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish with this campaign, Jason?" "The sale is legally binding. The contractual protections are in place. What's the endgame here?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the practiced righteous indignation slipped, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Part of me wants to make Dad regret his decision. Part of me genuinely believes these workers need someone fighting for them. And part of me just can't accept that 20 years of planning my future at Wright Enterprises was for nothing." The honesty was refreshing, a glimpse of the brother Vanessa remembered from before ambition and entitlement had hardened his perspectives. "I understand all of that," she said gently. "But consider the impact of your methods. Those workers at Portland, they're not pawns in a family power struggle. They're people with mortgages and kids in college and retirement plans built around their jobs at Wright. When you frighten them about their future for tactical advantage, there are real human consequences." Jason was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "You really think Pinnacle will keep its promises?" he finally asked, his voice less certain than before. "I think the contractual protections Dad negotiated are substantial," Vanessa replied. "And after meeting Rebecca Chen and hearing her specific commitments, yes, I believe there's reason for cautious optimism." She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand but bridging some of the distance between them. "The business decision is made, Jason. The question now is whether our family will be collateral damage in a battle that can't be won." The conversation continued for another hour, moving from business concerns to more personal territory. Their childhood memories, their mother's influence, the complex dynamics that had shaped their relationships with their father. No dramatic breakthrough occurred, but by the time they parted, something had shifted subtly between them, a tentative step toward understanding, if not yet reconciliation. As Vanessa walked away from the cafe, she felt a cautious hope that perhaps the Wright family might eventually find a new equilibrium, different from what any of them had expected, but potentially stronger for having weathered this storm together. The true test, she knew, would come in the weeks ahead, as Jason decided whether to continue his public campaign against the acquisition or to find a more constructive path forward. The business legacy of Wright Enterprises had been secured through Edward's careful planning. The family legacy remained very much in question. Back at Wright Enterprises headquarters, Edward reviewed the latest transition reports with Maria, feeling a growing confidence that despite the turbulence of recent weeks, the company's future was on solid ground. The employee meetings in Portland had already yielded positive results, with productivity returning to normal levels and anxiety noticeably reduced. "Rebecca Chen's team is integrating well with our department heads," Maria noted, highlighting several successful collaborative initiatives already underway. "There's actually excitement building about some of the technological upgrades Pinnacle is bringing to the table." Edward nodded, pleased but not surprised. He had chosen Pinnacle specifically for their compatible corporate culture and shared values around American manufacturing. "And the foundation paperwork?" he asked. "All finalized," Maria confirmed. "The Wright Family Foundation officially exists, with funding transfers scheduled to complete next week." As they concluded their meeting, Edward felt a sense of completion, not an ending, but the successful transition from one chapter to the next. Wright Enterprises would continue, its values and commitments intact, while the foundation would extend the family's positive impact in new directions. His son had accused him of holding the company back. Instead, Edward had ensured it would move forward with its soul intact, an achievement that would outlast any temporary family discord. The true measure of leadership, Edward had always believed, wasn't in avoiding difficult decisions but in making them with courage and integrity when the moment demanded. By that standard, selling Wright Enterprises had been his finest hour as a business leader, regardless of the personal cost. Whether his family would eventually understand that remained to be seen. But Edward Wright had done what he believed was right, for the company, for its employees, and for the communities that depended on it. In the end, that would have to be enough. The courthouse in downtown Portland had never hosted a business drama quite like the one unfolding in Judge Simmons' courtroom on a gray December morning 6 months after the sale of Wright Enterprises. Edward Wright sat at the defendant's table with his attorneys, maintaining the composed demeanor that had served him well throughout his career, while across the aisle, Jason occupied the plaintiff's side with his legal team from Harriman and Associates, an aggressive firm known for high-profile corporate disputes. The preliminary injunction Jason had sought to block the sale had been denied months ago, but his legal team had pressed forward with claims of breach of fiduciary duty and shareholder oppression. Today marked the final hearing after months of depositions, document discovery, and expert testimony. Judge Eleanor Simmons, a no-nonsense jurist with 25 years of experience in complex business litigation, had developed a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to focus on substantive issues. As she entered the courtroom, her expression gave no hint of her thoughts on the case that had generated significant media attention in business circles. Before we begin closing arguments, Judge Simmons addressed both parties. I want to clarify something. This court has heard extensive testimony about business strategy, market conditions, and corporate governance. What this court has not heard is a compelling legal argument for why Mr. Edward Wright's decision to sell Wright Enterprises to Pinnacle Industrial Group constituted either a breach of fiduciary duty or oppression of minority shareholders. The direct statement caught Jason's lead attorney off guard. He had prepared an emotionally charged closing argument focusing on family legacy and betrayal of trust rather than specific legal violations. Your Honor, he began, regaining his composure, our position is that the majority shareholder made decisions that fundamentally altered the nature of the enterprise without meaningful consultation with minority shareholders who had reasonable expectations about the company's future direction. Judge Simmons' expression remained neutral. Proceed with your closing argument, counselor. But I advise you to focus on legal standards rather than family dynamics. For the next 40 minutes, Jason's attorney presented his closing argument, emphasizing the absence of a formal board vote on the sale, Edward's alleged failure to explore alternatives that might have preserved family control, and the claim that the Wright family foundation structure represented self-dealing rather than maximizing shareholder value. Throughout the presentation, Edward maintained his composed expression, though he noted how Jason kept glancing in his direction, as if hoping to provoke a reaction that would validate his narrative of paternal betrayal. When Edward's lead counsel rose for the defense closing, her approach was markedly different, methodical, fact-based, and firmly anchored in legal precedent rather than emotional appeals. Your Honor, she began, the evidence presented has established 3 key facts beyond reasonable dispute. First, Mr. Edward Wright, as 82% voting shareholder, acted within his legal authority in approving the sale to Pinnacle Industrial Group. Second, the sale price of 23% above market valuation clearly satisfied any obligation to obtain fair value for shareholders. And third, the contractual protections negotiated for employees and communities represented appropriate consideration of stakeholder interests consistent with the business judgment rule. She systematically addressed and dismantled each of the plaintiff's claims, referring specifically to testimony and documentation rather than abstract principles or emotional arguments. The contrast between the two approaches was striking, one seeking to frame a business decision as a personal betrayal, the other grounding the discussion firmly in legal standards and factual evidence. As the arguments concluded, Judge Simmons spoke directly to both parties. I will issue my written ruling within 10 days. However, I feel compelled to make an observation. This case appears to be using the court system to adjudicate what is, at its core, a family disagreement about business philosophy and succession planning. While these are certainly important matters, they are not necessarily legal disputes requiring judicial intervention. Her gaze moved between Edward and Jason. I would strongly encourage the parties to consider whether continued litigation serves anyone's interests, or whether these resources might be better directed toward building new opportunities rather than fighting over past decisions. With that, she adjourned the hearing, leaving both Wright men to consider her pointed suggestion as they gathered their documents and prepared to leave the courtroom. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters had gathered, hoping for statements from both sides. Edward declined to comment, following his long-standing practice of keeping family matters private. Jason, however, stepped up to the microphones, clearly prepared to continue his public campaign. Today's hearing represents another step in holding accountable those who prioritize corporate interests over family legacy and worker security. He began, his rehearsed statement reflecting the same themes he had been emphasizing in media appearances for months. As Edward watched from a distance, he felt not anger but a profound sadness at how deeply entrenched his son had become in his position. The past 6 months had provided ample evidence that the sale to Pinnacle was indeed protecting Wright Enterprises' employees and values, yet Jason remained unwilling or unable to acknowledge this reality. 3 days later, in the living room of the Wright family home, Edward sat across from Vanessa, who had just returned from visiting manufacturing facilities in Detroit and Chicago as part of her new role with the Wright Family Foundation. The employee mood is remarkably positive, she reported, reviewing notes from her meetings. Pinnacle has already implemented the training programs for advanced manufacturing skills, and the first group of production workers is moving into technical specialist roles with significant pay increases. Edward nodded, pleased but not surprised. Rebecca Chin keeps her promises. That's why I trusted her with Wright's future. The community investment initiatives are gaining traction too, Vanessa continued. The apprenticeship program at Detroit Community College has twice as many applicants as available spots, and the small business development grants are generating real enthusiasm in both cities. The foundation work had become Vanessa's primary focus over the past months, drawing on both her business acumen and her genuine concern for the communities where Wright Enterprises operated. What had begun as a reluctant acceptance of her father's decision had evolved into passionate engagement with the foundation's mission. You've accomplished more in 6 months than most foundations do in their first 2 years, Edward observed. With pride. Vanessa smiled, acknowledging the compliment. It helps to have clear purpose and substantial resources. And surprisingly good partners in Pinnacle's community relations team. She hesitated before continuing. Have you heard from Jason since the hearing? Edward shook his head. Not directly. His attorneys filed some additional motions, but they feel perfunctory, more about maintaining the appearance of fighting than actually expecting to prevail. I saw him yesterday, Vanessa said carefully. He's starting something new, a consulting firm focused on helping family businesses navigate succession and modernization. Apparently some of the contacts he made during his campaign against the sale have turned into clients. The news caught Edward by surprise. That's unexpected, is it? Vanessa challenged gently. Jason has always been drawn to dramatic transformation and bold moves. Now he's positioning himself as an expert in exactly that space, just from the consulting side rather than as an operator. Edward considered this perspective. And the anti-Pinnacle rhetoric? Toned down significantly, Vanessa reported. He's shifting from attacking the sale to framing himself as an advocate for intentional transition in family enterprises. Still dramatic, still centered on his vision of business evolution, but less directly antagonistic toward you and Pinnacle. It wasn't reconciliation, but it represented a potential shift from destructive opposition to something that might eventually allow for healing. Jason was finding a way to reframe his experience into something constructive, even if he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge the validity of Edward's decisions. That's positive, Edward said finally. For him, and for all of us. Vanessa nodded, then changed the subject to the foundation's upcoming board meeting. But the news about Jason lingered in Edward's mind, a reminder that even the most painful transitions could sometimes lead to unexpected growth. The following week brought Judge Simmons' ruling, delivered via courier to Edward's home and Jason's office simultaneously. The 20-page document systematically addressed each legal claim, ultimately dismissing the entire case with prejudice, meaning Jason could not refile similar claims in the future. The language was measured but unambiguous, the court finds that defendant Edward Wright acted within his legal authority as majority shareholder, fulfilled all fiduciary obligations to minority shareholders through obtaining premium valuation, and exercised appropriate business judgment in negotiating worker and community protections as part of the transaction. The plaintiff's claims of oppression and breach of duty are therefore dismissed with prejudice. A separate section addressed Jason's claims about the Wright Family Foundation structure. The court finds that the creation of a charitable foundation with the majority of sale proceeds, while perhaps disappointing to plaintiff's expectations, of personal inheritance, represents a legitimate exercise of defendant's rights to direct his assets according to his values and priorities. The legal victory was complete, just as Edward's attorneys had predicted. Yet as he read through the document, Edward felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the judge had recognized the legitimacy of his actions, coupled with continued sadness about the family breach the conflict had created. His phone rang, displaying Maria's name on the caller ID. "I assume you've seen the ruling," she said when he answered. "Just finished reading it," Edward confirmed. "A comprehensive dismissal, as expected." "There's something else you should know," Maria continued. "Rebecca called this morning. Pinnacle's board has approved the expansion plan for the Portland facility, the one that was in early discussion when we sold. They're adding the advanced composites line we had been considering, which means 50 new technical positions and significant capital investment." The news represented exactly the kind of strategic growth Edward had always envisioned for Wright Enterprises, expansion that built on existing strengths rather than dismantling core operations in pursuit of marginally higher returns. "That's excellent news," Edward said sincerely. "When will they announce?" "Next week. They want you there for the groundbreaking if you're willing. As the founder's son and the person who negotiated the sale that's making this possible." Edward agreed immediately, recognizing the importance of his visible support for Pinnacle's stewardship of Wright's legacy. As he hung up, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year, from the confrontational board meeting where Jason had accused him of holding the company back to this moment of vindication as Pinnacle demonstrated exactly the kind of thoughtful growth he had hoped to see. The groundbreaking ceremony at the Portland facility took place on a surprisingly sunny December morning. The event had drawn significant media attention, with business reporters from regional and national outlets covering what Pinnacle was promoting as a landmark investment in American advanced manufacturing. Edward stood among the assembled dignitaries, including Rebecca Chen, local elected officials, and senior Pinnacle and Wright executives. The crowd of employees watched with evident excitement as Rebecca outlined the expansion plans, emphasizing not just the capital investment but the career advancement opportunities for existing workers. "This expansion represents our commitment to building on Wright Enterprises' legacy of quality, innovation, and community investment," Rebecca said, directly acknowledging Edward's influence on Pinnacle's approach. "We're not just maintaining what we acquired, we're growing it thoughtfully, creating new opportunities while honoring established values." When it was Edward's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief and focused on the employees rather than the executives or officials. "When I made the decision to entrust Wright Enterprises to Pinnacle Industrial, I did so because I believed they would be proper stewards of not just our physical assets, but our most important asset, our people," he told the assembled workers. Today's announcement confirms that trust was well placed. He spoke about his father's original vision for Wright Enterprises as not just a business but a community cornerstone, providing stable employment and advancement opportunities for generations of families. "This expansion continues that tradition," he concluded, ensuring that Wright's legacy of quality and opportunity will extend far into the future. As the ceremonial shovels turned the first soil for the new facility, Edward noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the crowd, Jason, dressed in a business suit rather than his usual casual attire, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Jason gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to leave. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, perhaps the first step toward something more. Later that afternoon, as Edward prepared to return to the family home, he received a text message from an unexpected source: "Congratulations on the expansion announcement. The technical training program looks particularly promising. J." The message was brief and carefully neutral, but its very existence represented a shift in their non-relationship of the past months. Edward considered his response carefully before typing, "Thank you. The Foundation would welcome your perspective on the training curriculum if you're interested." There was no immediate reply, which didn't surprise Edward. Healing would take time, if it happened at all. But the door had been cracked open, however slightly. 1 year after the sale of Wright Enterprises, Edward Wright stood in the ballroom of the Grand Hotel, watching as community leaders, business executives, and foundation partners mingled at the first annual Wright Family Foundation Gala. The event had been Vanessa's idea, a way to showcase the foundation's initial accomplishments and build relationships with other organizations working in workforce development and community investment. The foundation's first year had exceeded even Edward's optimistic projections. Educational initiatives in 5 communities where Wright facilities operated had provided advanced manufacturing training to over 300 workers. Small business development grants had helped launch 42 new enterprises in those same communities. And partnerships with community colleges had created apprenticeship programs that were becoming national models for technical workforce development. Vanessa approached, elegant in a simple black dress, her confident stride reflecting how thoroughly she had embraced her role as the foundation's executive director. Senator Williams just confirmed his support for the federal apprenticeship legislation, she reported. Having Pinnacle and 3 other major manufacturers behind it made the difference. Edward nodded, pleased but not surprised. The foundation's work had quickly gained credibility because it paired substantial funding with practical knowledge of manufacturing workforce needs, a combination that was proving remarkably effective in policy circles. And the Detroit initiative? He asked. Fully funded, Vanessa confirmed with satisfaction. We'll break ground on the training center in March. As they continued discussing foundation business, Edward noticed a stir near the entrance to the ballroom. Turning, he saw what had caught people's attention. Jason had arrived, accompanied by his wife Claire, both dressed formally for the occasion. His presence was unexpected. Though the family tension had eased somewhat over the past year, with occasional text messages and one brief meeting when Vanessa had facilitated a discussion about potential collaboration between Jason's consulting firm and the foundation, this was the first public family event Jason had attended since the legal battle ended. Vanessa spotted her brother and excused herself to greet him, leaving Edward to observe from a distance. The siblings embraced warmly, with Vanessa making introductions between Jason and several foundation board members. Edward remained where he was, not wanting to create awkwardness by approaching too quickly. Instead, he engaged in conversation with the mayor of Portland, discussing the impact of the new manufacturing line that had begun operation the previous month. Eventually, as the evening progressed, Jason made his way through the crowd toward Edward. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of the past year's conflict hung between them. Then Jason extended his hand. The foundation's work is impressive, he said simply. Particularly the technical training programs. Edward accepted the handshake, recognizing the effort it represented. Thank you. Vanessa has been the driving force behind much of it. An uncomfortable silence followed, both men searching for neutral territory in a relationship that had been defined by conflict for too long. I visited the Portland facility last week, Jason said finally. The new production line is remarkable. Exactly the kind of advanced manufacturing capability I always believed Wright should develop. The acknowledgement was significant. Not just of the facility's technical impressiveness, but of the alignment between Pinnacle's strategic direction and what Jason himself had advocated, albeit with very different methods. Rebecca Chin understands both the technology and the human elements of manufacturing, Edward replied. It's why I trusted her with Wright's future. Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. My consulting firm is working with several family businesses navigating succession and modernization challenges. It's educational to see the process from the advisor's side rather than as a participant. Edward recognized the statement for what it was, not quite an admission that his approach had been flawed, but an acknowledgement that the issues were more complex than he had previously recognized. If you'd ever be willing to share those insights with the foundation board, Edward offered carefully, I think there would be value in your perspective. It wasn't full reconciliation, but it was an opening, an opportunity for their relationship to evolve into something new, based on mutual respect rather than the bitter conflict of the past. Jason seemed to consider the invitation, weighing it against whatever reservations he still harbored. I'll think about it, he said finally. Thank you. As he moved away to rejoin Claire, Edward felt a cautious optimism. The breach hadn't fully healed, but a bridge was being constructed, however tentative its initial span. Later that evening, as the gala concluded, Edward found himself on the hotel's terrace, taking a moment of quiet reflection before heading home. The city lights spread before him, including the distant glow of the industrial district where Wright Enterprises had operated for generations. Vanessa joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. Jason's attendance was unexpected, she observed. But welcome, Edward added. He's changed, Vanessa noted. The consulting work has given him perspective he didn't have before. He's seeing firsthand how family business transitions can go wrong when ego and entitlement drive decisions. Edward nodded, considering the irony. So he's learning from our conflict after all, just not in the way either of us would have predicted. Life rarely follows the paths we plan, Vanessa observed, echoing wisdom her mother had often shared. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, father and daughter surveying the city their family had helped build through generations of manufacturing leadership. You were right, Vanessa said finally. About selling to Pinnacle. About the foundation structure. About protecting what mattered most in Wright's legacy. The acknowledgement meant more coming now, after a year of tangible evidence, than it would have immediately after the decision. And you were right about finding a way to maintain family bonds despite our disagreements, Edward replied. Your bridge building with Jason made tonight possible. Another comfortable silence fell between them, until Vanessa asked the question that had been on her mind throughout the evening's success. Do you have any regrets? About how it all unfolded? Edward considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer rather than a convenient one. I regret the pain it caused, he said finally. I regret that protecting Wright's legacy required such a high personal cost. But the decision itself? No. Seeing what Pinnacle has accomplished with the company, what the foundation has achieved in communities, what you and even Jason have become through this challenge, I can't regret the outcome, even if I wish the path had been less difficult. Vanessa nodded, understanding the nuanced response. Mom would be proud, she said simply. Of all of us, in different ways. As they prepared to leave, Edward took one last look at the city skyline, reflecting on the journey of the past 18 months. His son had accused him of holding the company back, triggering a decision that had transformed not just Wright Enterprises but the entire family. In selling the business, Edward had freed it to grow in ways that honored its legacy rather than dismantling it. In creating the foundation, he had extended the family's positive impact far beyond what might have been possible through continued private ownership. And in weathering the conflict that followed, the family had begun to forge new relationships, based on adult respect rather than inherited expectations. His father had built Wright Enterprises on principles of quality, reliability, and commitment to people. Edward had protected those principles, even when doing so meant letting go of family control. That paradox, that sometimes holding on requires letting go, would define his legacy as surely as the manufacturing excellence had defined his father's. As Edward and Vanessa walked together toward the waiting car, their conversation turned to future foundation initiatives and potential new partnerships. The past had been honored, but their focus now was firmly on building what came next, a future that neither of them could have imagined when the family conflict began, but one that promised to extend the Wright legacy in ways both meaningful and enduring. Edward Wright had been accused of holding the company back. Instead, he had moved it, and his family, forward into a future grounded in values that would outlast any individual leadership or ownership structure. That, he reflected, was a legacy worth the difficult journey it had required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload. From us,